real safe. You could be a doctor, accountant, or something sane. But growing up, parents got me a guitar. Said you could do anything, kid, you could go far. You could be the president, fireman, race cars. The sky's the limit, kid, so shoot for the stars. So I strummed that guitar every day. Found the passion for music never went away. I joined a couple bands and played a few shows. Tried to impress the girl in the front row. But soon enough, everything starts to change. As you grow up, nobody treats you the same. They try to take your future and make it real safe. You could be a doctor, accountant, or something sane. But yo, whatever happened to the sky was the limit. I fell in love with music, never thought it was a gimmick. I worked so hard on every tune and every single lyric. My whole identity depended on being artistic. Now you wanna strip that away so you feel okay? Cause if I make it to the top, what does that really say? That you shouldn't have given up, that you made the mistake? But if I fail, you feel much better about picking your lane, right? Yeah, things are gonna get better real soon. Yeah, I'ma just do me, you just do you. I swear it's gonna get better real soon. Don't let anyone tell you what you should do. I got a clear view. We're gonna make it soon. Just keep pushing through. You're what you got to lose. You're what you got to lose. You're what you got to lose. Just keep pushing through. Cause what you got to lose, 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 got to lose. I won't give up, I won't back down till the line sinks in underneath the deep ground. I won't give up, I won't back down. There's nobody stopping me except for me now. I won't give up, I won't back down till the line sinks in underneath the deep ground. I won't give up, I won't back down. There's nobody stopping me except for me now. Honest, life's a competition. So if I'm going to play, then I'm gonna play to win it. I refuse to sit and rot at a desk all day unless I have a passion I'm working towards, okay? I'd rather be dead on the outside than inside. A bullet to the head than 25 to life in a cubicle alone, just trying to get by, building someone else's dream instead of building mine. If you're hearing me, this is meant to inspire. If you have a dream or if you have desires, a girl in your life that's making you feel that fire, go fight for her man, go die for her man. Cause you only have one life, one chance to do it, one chance to prove it to yourself, so don't lose it. You got this, fam, just keep pushing on through it. One day you'll look back so glad you pursued it. Yeah, things are gonna get better real soon. Yeah, I'ma just do me, you just do you.
What a day.
I swear it's gonna get better real soon. Don't let anyone tell you what you should do.
All right, so the first thing I want to talk about tonight is that episode of X-Men 97. Wow. Okay, so I've read Mutant Massacre, the stuff with Genosha beforehand, the new X-Men. I've read it. I'm not really reading Krakoa's stuff. I'm not really into that. I haven't really enjoyed the current run of X-Men. Hopefully the next run's going to be good. But that being said, wow, was this episode amazing. I cried. Seriously, straight up, I cried. I'm sure they're going to undo some of it. I'm still hoping we're going to get Age of Apocalypse, Wolverine and Age of Apocalypse, Jean Grey at some point. I don't know why I'm hoping for that. There's no reason for that to even be in the show, but I am. But wow, if you haven't watched today's episode of X-Men, you really should. Hi, Lisa. All right, so we are going to start. It's going to be a Bart Ehrman day. It's going to be a short day. I don't feel real good. I felt sick today. So here we go. Let me know how the sound is, okay?
They would have an enslaved staff working for them, and that staff would be young.
Okay.
They would be children, and that's the evidence. If you want something really beautiful made for you, we don't. If you have something short, like Paul's letter to Philemon, that's a different situation.
Okay.
Sort of anyone who is literate could write that out for you. But even copying Romans, that's effort, that's work. And the copyists in particular in this period seem to have been enslaved or formerly enslaved.
Okay, good. Okay, we need to take just a quick break, quick commercial break, and we'll be right back.
Attention retirees, if you're willing to be at your computer from 9 a.m. to 10:45 a.m.
From how educated people are being trained, because within the educational curriculum, people in the Roman world, at least, they learn to read first, and then they learn how to copy letters, and they learn how to compose. But it's a very long kind of process. And so, does the slave education happen the same way as the freed person's education?
It depends. So you do have people who actually end up being sort of distinguished educators, which is also a profession for enslaved people, who they learn to read and write just because they were accompanying an enslaved child to school. So that child was getting that elite education, and they just went there too. And there are a lot of examples of that. And that probably would have been the case for a large number of people. There are some dedicated schools for enslaved children. Pliny says that he had one on his property. There's an imperial school in Rome that's very famous because it has a piece of graffiti known as the Alexamenos graffito, where you have Jesus being crucified with a donkey head. That was a school for
Something that gets ignored a lot by atheists, by the way, is that little fact.
enslaved children in the imperial household. There would have been some specialization, though, once you've learned some education, and you'd be listening and doing the same sort of things as elite children, but you might, if you were a particular enslaved worker, accompany a freeborn person to what we might call university. But you also might get specialist training in accounting or shorthand or other kinds of literate work that would be specialized, that would be about putting you to good use, they would say.
Yeah. Okay, good. So I want to move on to the New Testament specifically, but I think it's the lead into that. You talk about a lot of figures in the New Testament who that you proposed.
I love how terrible of a host Bart Ehrman is, by the way. Yeah, the donkey head. Oh, Lisa, you don't know that one. Okay, so one of the first, if not the first, depiction of Jesus Christ is Romans mocking him. And it's an image of a donkey being crucified. That's the first image of Christ. Also, I think Lucian does a pretty good spends a pretty good time mocking Christians as well.
So we're probably enslaved, and I have a question about that I think maybe a lot of readers will have when you identify this person or that person possibly enslaved. I'm just wondering how do we go about identifying?
Spends a pretty good time
people as slaves. If you don't have somebody who says I'm enslaved, I'm a doulos, which is the Greek word for a slave, or how do we? So I mean, sometimes you can do it by names, right? And sometimes somebody has a name that somebody who is enslaved is often given a name by. And the name has some kind of like meaning to it, useful person or something like that, happy person. And so sometimes you can do it by name. Sometimes we have information, right? I mean, like in the New Testament, we know that Onesimus was a slave because Paul talks about him in Philemon, right. And he was a slave. And outside the New Testament, my favorite, I'm sure we've talked about him before, Epictetus. My favorite philosopher from the ancient world is Epictetus, who had been enslaved to a master who himself had been enslaved, was a slave serving under Nero. And so we can trace this because they talk about it. But when you just get a name of somebody and they're just doing something, how how do we decide? Like, is this person probably enslaved or not? Or how do we make a decision?
Yeah. So I think the first thing we have to do when we're talking about the New Testament is start with just no assumptions. Because the problem with New Testament figures is you have traditions, maybe beginning with Acts, but then sometimes spanning 400 or 500 years about who these people were. And in the case of, say, Paul's companions, they often wind up being.
So that does bother me that considering that a lot of the best research that you can find on the church fathers is coming from the Bible, is coming from references to the church fathers, that academics will immediately throw away tradition as a source of reference because they're using tradition to do their discoveries, and yet somehow tradition's a bad word. I don't know. That's always bothered me. It seems like a double standard.
Bishops in later tradition. And so you have to kind of put aside all of that. And I would say put aside Acts, which I think is later, and supplementing tradition, and just look at what the person's name is and what kind of.
Did she say she thinks Acts is dated later? That's interesting.
Work they're doing. And I would also like to know, you said, well, and it's a great question, well, if it doesn't say that there are doulos, how would we know if there are doulos? And I just like to point out that there are many people in the New Testament who are identified as douloi, as slaves, and we do not take that seriously. Well, it's a metaphor. And so there are all kinds of double standards going on here. So when you have someone in the New Testament who you just have their name, I'm looking for two things. What kind of work are they doing? Is that the work that typically an enslaved person would do, or a formerly enslaved person? And what about the name? So there are names. You mentioned Onesimus, Epaphroditus, Tertius. These are all, Fortunatus. These are all really common names for enslaved persons. You would never, if you were freeborn, you would never call your child Epaphroditus. Like, that's not a good name for a freeborn child.
What's it mean?
Charming, lovely. It's a name used particularly for boys, young boys who are adorable and work at table.
Is it related to Aphrodite?
It's not related to Aphrodite. And then we have the abbreviation Epaphras as well. And these are, if you go, there are German scholars who have done this because they love to do this kind of thing, compile multi-volume works of all of the names for inscriptions of people who we know are enslaved. Onesimus, Epaphroditus, Fortunatus, these are all top 10 names for enslaved people. So if you're coming in and you have no idea who they are, and you see someone and they have a name that generally is used of enslaved people, and they are doing work that generally is performed by enslaved people, that might not be enough to get us to they were definitely a slave. But we also should not be saying they're definitely a freeborn volunteer. That is taking all of the evidence.
Yeah, fair enough. Yeah. So Tertius, I was going to begin at Tertius because so for people who don't know, Paul writes his letter to the Romans that you mentioned a minute ago. It's a long letter, 16 chapters, it's the longest letter that we have. And at the end of it, in chapter 16, Paul's greeting a bunch of people. He greets so-and-so and so-and-so and so-and-so. And all of a sudden you get this verse where it says, I, Tertius, greet you. wait a second. The writer of this letter, I, Tertius, the writer of this letter, greet you.
It's funny is that when you're reading the Bible for religious reasons, a lot of this stuff doesn't really matter. It's not. They're background characters. They're tertiary. This is not stuff that you concentrate on when you're doing the readings, whether it's for religious reasons or for personal reasons. It's not really something you look at. So I can see where people would miss these references, even before you get into the cultural differences and all that kind of stuff.
Wait a second. I thought Paul was writing this letter. So it's clear that Paul's dictating this letter and Tertius is the guy he's dictating to. Am I right so far?
That is exactly right.
Okay. So, right. And there's other evidence, as you point out, that Paul was dictating his letters and somebody else is writing it. And so you talk about Tertius as a slave. And could you just explain, because I think, all you have is that thing, I, Tertius, greet you. And so explain. So, yeah, just explain. So what is it? Are you saying that are you pretty sure?
And I don't understand why that can't be true for the entire New Testament, except for the ones that say they're actually being written by someone. Why it can't all just be dictated? I mean, even if we're using other sources and we're using oral tradition and all that, why it can't just be a dictation at the end before it hits paper? I don't understand why that's an objection that atheists usually give. Seems reasonable to me. It seems like that's how it would have happened. So whenever I hear Bart Ehrman, or I can't remember any of the other professors I used to watch, but the one from Yale University, the one from New York University, he used to do this. New Mexico University. All of these professors, when they say that, it's never been shocking to me. It just seems like of course that's how it was. Of course they had to dictate to a slave or to a scribe of some kind. So I just don't see how that's controversial.
He's a slave. You think he's a slave? Maybe he's a slave. What and how? Just tell me about your thought process.
Okay, so tertius, it means third. That's a pretty common name for an enslaved person. It is, as you say, a very long letter. You want someone who's a little bit professionalized, because it would be very hard for someone who wasn't to do this. It's actually early tradition that identifies who he's enslaved to. I would say if we have to make a judgment about who he is, we would come down on the side of enslaved or formerly enslaved. That's who Tertius is. And then there's a question of like, how important is he? Sometimes people say to me, oh, well, they're just secretaries. They don't do anything. And I would say, I understand why they say that. They say that because ancient Roman authors tell us that secretaries don't do anything. They're just mouthpieces.
And that's kind of what I just said. So she's going to directly address what I just asked. So that's kind of cool.
Hand of the author. They're the mouth of the author. But then once I started looking at how you took dictation, it's clear that it's a fairly involved process, and it's very creative. So ancient shorthand, unlike modern shorthand, it's not entirely standardized.
So let's say that, and I've heard this argument from Christian apologists, so I don't see a problem here. But let's say that's absolutely correct. So each scribe has their own style that they insert into the writing. Wouldn't that then make a case for the pseudepigraphal writings to actually be official or authentic if each scribe is putting in their own style? So therefore, of course, it's going to sound different. I know I'm kind of slicing hairs here and playing a little bit of devil's advocate. But if that is the case, and I do think that is the case, that each scribe would insert their style into what they're writing, words would be different, verb choices would be different. And then if you take the tradition and let the tradition develop a little bit before it inserts into the canon, it would make sense that each community would then reshape whatever letter or whatever version of the gospel they have to reflect their community's needs. So that makes perfect sense. That doesn't take away from original authorship or from one of the apostles being the original narrator of the oral version of the story. At least not for me.
There's ancient shorthand we still can't read, and it's very ambiguous. Sometimes the same sign is used for multiple words. So whoever's taking down the shorthand then needs to translate it back into longhand later. And in doing that, they would have to recall what had happened, make judgment calls about the style and improving things. If a sentence was given and it was a little bit awkward, they would change that because that is their job. They are doing that kind of editorial work. And so it's actually a very creative process. They aren't just mouthpieces. And I think,
again, doesn't that hurt, though, some of the stronger implications of the very things like Bart Ehrman says in Forged? Wouldn't that hurt? Because I'm totally down for later dating. That doesn't bother me at all for when the actual oral tradition or the school of thought entered the written page. Like, that doesn't bother me at all, because again, we can still have oral transmission. But doesn't her thesis, at least in this public work, hurt some of the arguments, like let's say some of the people on MythVision have, or some of the people on I was just watching Apologia earlier today, him and Shannon Q and someone else, the Thinking Atheist, I think it was. Like, doesn't that hurt Matt Dillahunty's case for not only mythicism, but hurt the case for disproving the Bible? if other scholars are saying, no, this is exactly what would happen if these are the scribes, then this is the process. Doesn't that hurt that? And I heard that she said she's later dating Acts, so she's not even viewing it in this way. But wouldn't the implication be that if we're trying to tie it down to earlier dating, wouldn't that hurt the arguments of the more dismissive scholars or more dismissive scholarship? I don't know. I don't know the current state of academia. I'm just saying, is her work going to push or change the direction of current theories?
Anybody who's ever done secretarial work will tell you that actually it's fairly active. Even if you're supposed to do what your enslaver wants, you're still making judgments that are really important and affect the outcome of whatever you're doing. This isn't inconsequential work. And I understand why this might be a little troubling to some people, because now it opens up a whole range of questions of how much of this is Paul, who is this person, if they're enslaved, do we even really know if they're Christian? I understand why, this would make many people nervous.
Well,
Not you.
It doesn't make me nervous. I like what you're saying, so I like it. I like it. I like it. I endorse your book, even though I haven't read it yet.
Well, not so much. I mean, I think, if people taking dictation were crafting some of the writing themselves, that'd be significant. But it wouldn't be any more significant if it was a slave than if it was not a slave, right? I mean, it's just somebody else's crafting.
I agree. I don't think it makes more of a difference if it's an enslaved person or not an enslaved person in terms of the changes they might make. What it does make a difference about is it makes a difference in terms of how visible they are to us in the historical record. Because enslaved people are written out. It makes more of a difference if it's an enslaved person or not an enslaved person in terms of the changes they might make. What it does make a difference about is it makes a difference in terms of how visible they are to us in the historical record. Because enslaved people are written out of this history. We don't see them because enslavers don't think of them as people necessarily. And I would say the enslaved piece is important to some Christians who are concerned about, what if they're not a Christian? What if they're just an enslaved person? And that might worry them. So that's why it's relevant.
Since he's greeting the church, probably. But in any event, I would
agree. He's part of this, but we don't know. I mean, I'm not bothered by the idea that he might not be Christian. I don't really mind. But what I am interested in is the fact that the role of people like this is generally obscured from our historical narrative, which is really why we haven't spoken about it before.
Yeah. Well, I mean, partly they're obscure because all we have is I, Tertius Greek. So that's, it's kind of obscure.
Well, okay, so I kind of disagree with her last statement just because I've heard apologists, before I knew what apologetics was, I'm talking about like when I was a teenager, I've heard apologists make claims like this. So this is perfectly in line with my understanding of Christianity pre my academic, what do you want to call it, horizons. So I mean, I don't know. I don't know. Is her academic revelation unintentionally counter-secular? Like, if it plays into the understanding that Christians traditionally have of these works, which is, again, what she's saying perfectly in lines with anything I've heard on EWTN, anything I've heard on Catholic Answers, anything I heard on that from that crazy Baptist preacher I would listen to on a Saturday morning when I woke up a little bit too early and I wanted to watch my Saturday morning cartoons. I don't know. Is it counter-academic? Counter-academia? I need a new word. Someone give me a new word. All right, let's keep going. I like this lady. I like what she's saying.
What we'd really like is a scribe who's like an enslaved scribe change some of these ethical requirements of the household, where it says, slaves obey your masters. We like to say, slaves, and masters, set your slaves free. That would be a nice textual change.
And again, what if some of the slave writing stuff in there is actually because it was a slave who was writing it? That would be great. Like that's perfectly in line with the idea of development and progressive revelation. That would be a great for me, that would be a great argument for inspiration, that it doesn't matter who the anonymous writer is posed to be, as the inspired word is what we're getting. We're getting the positive message. We're getting the woman at the well. We're getting the what's the medieval input? The one that everybody likes, the woman with adultery. We're getting these inputs that develop the idea of the faith, and they're in line with the Christian principles. I love this. I love it. Inerrantists might not like it. Literalists might not like it. I don't know how other scholars feel about her work, but I like it. I like this theory a lot.
Jade, but we don't have.
Yeah, well, we don't have that. And of course, a really excellent secretary or copyist writes themselves into non-existence. You don't know what they did do. What we do have is we have multiple people producing a text that we credit just one of those people. So we don't know what Tertius did. We do have a manuscript, P. Beryl 11632. It's one of those few autographs where someone, I wrote an article about it, perhaps an enslaved secretary or scribe, the person who took dictation then crossed out part of the text and inserted enslaved people back into the story. So we could imagine that they're doing exactly what you want. But we don't have any autographs of the New Testament.
I've noticed that, yeah.
You may know. I don't know.
So let's move off of Tertius, because most people never heard of him. But I mean, some have. But I want to get to Mark, because you argue that the author of the Gospel of Mark may have been enslaved. Am I correct?
I think that when people start to talk about who Mark is, they seem to think that he was enslaved.
People tend to think he's enslaved?
They think that he does enslaved work. So he's described as an interpreter, Papias. You translate him.
Oh, you mean ancient people? You mean ancient people? Yeah. I thought you meant people today think of Mark as a slave. I've never heard of anybody say that.
I'd love to get them around in that perspective. So Papias pictures Mark as, a hermeneutic.
I love Bart's face. Wow. I love it. That's the face that most Christians make when they're listening to Bart. So I love that. I love this. I love how his reaction is very much the Christian reaction to him. This is good stuff. Okay.
Whatever that is, interpreter, translator. And when you go look in the papyrological record and you look at who's doing that work, they're often almost always enslaved or formerly enslaved. You have a lot of people with that title who actually can't read or write, who have people working for them. And the reason why Papias presents Mark in this way is because Papias wants to have Mark be the kind of faithful mouthpiece for Peter. He's trying to get back to Peter. But what you see in that dynamic is a very common writing dynamic. When people write, you have an author dictating to a person who is well educated. And in the case of early Christians, you can imagine that they would be using secretaries who had a higher level of education than them, who would have been loaned to them or.
Am I wrong, or didn't Frank Turret have like a whole thing? I'm not a Frank Turret fan, so I don't watch much of his stuff, but I remember someone, either Frank Turret or someone like him, had a whole thing where that's how he said the Bible was actually done, was through these scribes. That's why it's not in the Aramaic. I think it was Frank Turek.
Printed. And so it's not, I don't think we can categorically say who Mark was, but we can say that when people start thinking about it, they think he's doing that kind of work. They're picturing him in that way. And when you read the Gospel of Mark and you think about that in your mind.
Before you get to Gospel of Mark, I wanted to get, some people may not know who Papias is, and some may not know what you and I are talking about. So Papias is an early no, it's fine. He's an early 2nd century church father. He wrote a 5-volume work. We don't have it, but we have some quotations of it from later writers. And probably, I don't know when you date him. I date him around 130 or so, but people have different dates for him. But he says at one point that Mark was the interpreter or the translator of Peter. And what you're saying is, if that's the case, then that would suggest that he might have been a slave. Mm-hmm. So, do you think Papias is accurate? I mean, do you trust Papias's report about Peter having this person Mark write his account?
And I have that question more generally about all the early church fathers and especially the anti-Nicene fathers. I still don't like saying anti-Nicene. It still sounds like it says anti, like not. Anyway. Pre-Nicene. I really do wonder how reliable most scholars consider these texts. I know that some of them, they don't even consider them legit. They consider them either forgeries or pseudepigrapha themselves. But I really do wonder how reliable the stories that these early church fathers tell of their predecessors, how much academia gives credence to these claims.
I mean, Peter having this person, Mark. Well, I think that Mark was written after 70, and all early Christian accounts say that Peter was dead by then. So Papias's sort of narrative about how the writing happened does allow for there to be a gap between Mark learning about things from Peter and writing it down. So it is still possible. I think it would make me sound much more apologetic than I am to say, I think Papias is right. It comes from Peter. Yeah. Certainly, there are a lot of Peter traditions there. What I think is more likely is that by the 2nd century, you have this emerging.
I'm going to play what she just said again.
Things from Peter and writing it down.
I'm going to play what she just said again because, like I said, she sounds very much in line with late 90s, early 2000s apologetics that I heard. So let me play that part again.
And Papias's sort of narrative about how the writing happened does allow for there to be a gap between Mark learning about things from Peter and writing it down. So it is still possible. I think it would make me sound much more apologetic than I am to say, I think Papias is right. It comes from Peter. Yeah. Certainly, there are a lot of Peter traditions there. What I think is more likely is that by the 2nd century, you have this emerging Peter-Mark tradition. Because one of the big questions is, why is it called the Gospel of Mark? If it is Peter, why isn't it called the Gospel of Peter? And you can't say, well, there's another Gospel of Peter, because that hasn't been written yet. I think it's called the Gospel of Mark because by the 2nd century, people worry about getting the right copies of texts. Yeah. And by saying, well, this is the Gospel of Mark, you're saying, look, this is written by the right secretary. It has a good textual history. You would want a copy of Cicero's work written down by his favorite secretary, Tiro, and here's Mark writing for Peter. So there's a tradition about it. Do I think Peter was truly involved in the composition of Mark? I'm not willing to say that.
Yeah. I mean, okay. So, but that leads you into the question, though, of whether Mark was enslaved, because you have this early tradition where Papias describes the person who actually wrote the gospel as doing the kind of work that a slave might have done. But then you're going to talk about Mark itself, like something in the Gospel of Mark. Go ahead.
Yeah. So what I would say is I think that dynamic is typical of how people wrote longer texts like Gospels. That kind of, you have an author dictating. And if you read New Testament accounts, if you read the Gospels and you think about it as there's an enslaved person in the room contributing, helping shape this story. And we know it's a story that's been shaped. This is not court reporting. And you read the.
And again, as someone who takes it as inspired, I don't have any problem with saying that it was shaped by the authors who wrote it, or even the schools who protected it, or meaning the churches. I don't have any problem with development of the text from whatever the original oral version was. So, yeah.
Gospel of Mark, then, it reads quite differently. And it's not that I think that whoever the enslaved person was who was in the room has changed the entire story. I think they leave gaps and phrase things in certain ways to speak to their own community. I think anyone who learned to be a New Testament scholar was told that the intentions of the person who wrote the text matter. And I think that is true of Mark and the composition of Mark too. I think that's true of so many early Christian texts. When I read Mark now, I realize, wow, Jesus does not have a named father in this text. There's no Joseph. There's no even son of a carpenter. It's a really easy gap to plug. And someone decided not to do that. They allowed for the possibility, as what happened later, that people would say that his mother was a sex worker or had relations with a Roman soldier. They just didn't mention a father. But that was an experience that lots of enslaved people would have had. I see Jesus talking in parables, which is a form of speech commonly associated with enslaved people. I see a man who gets crucified, which we always talk about brigands and treason and rebellion, but this is the way in which you execute enslaved people in antiquity. That's its primary role. I think when you look at Jesus throughout the Gospel of Mark, he actually looks quite slavish. This is not to say that he was enslaved historically, but that whoever is composing this text is allowing space for that interpretation because of who they are and for whom they're writing.
You think Mark is suggesting to his audience that Jesus is enslaved?
I think he's allowing people to reach that conclusion if they want to, but he's not saying that. I think, when we're looking for what kinds of changes could enslaved people have made, not huge ones. He's not going to ride off on a unicorn into the heavens, But there are things that can be sort of like slightly altered, shaped in certain ways. It's the kind of thing that if you were enslaved, you would notice, but if you weren't, you might pass over.
Okay. A second ago, you said something about Mary being a sex worker. What? So I mean, by sex worker, you mean you're talking about somebody who gets paid for sex.
Yes.
Okay. So who says that? You lost me on that one. Where did you get that?
So
and you're saying that Mark.
She lost me there too. I was with her for a little while, actually for most of this video. And then she went to the slave narrative thing, which at first I was going to speak on because Jesus took on the form of a slave, so to win our freedom, our freedom from sin, our freedom to worship God openly. These are part of liturgical prayers. You might not necessarily see them within the Gospels themselves or within the biblical text, but you see them paralleled. Christians outside of Protestantism believe there's at least 3 columns that we can lean on, 3 legs. One of them is liturgy, one of them is holy tradition, think church fathers, and then one of them is and you can also think of it as oral tradition, but that's not really. But yeah, so you got the tradition, holy tradition, you got liturgy, and then you got the Gospels. So for a second, I was going to start agreeing with her, and then she went off into the sex worker stuff, and I was like, well, I can't agree with that, and I was chewing on ice. And then Bart Ehrman said it for me, so there we go.
Might suggest it? Is that right?
I don't think Mark's suggesting it. I think Mark is suggesting that Jesus doesn't have a legal father, which is the status for enslaved people or anyone who had been orphaned in the first Jewish war. That's an experience that a lot of people would have had. They wouldn't have had fathers anymore.
Yeah.
But by not identifying a legal father, he's also suggesting that there is no legal father. That reads as enslavement or being orphaned. But in the antiquity, the way people read that was maybe she's sleeping around.
Yeah.
And Matthew, Luke, and John sort of change this in certain ways. Matthew, not as successfully as you would think, given that he has a genealogy that also includes sex workers. But then you have, both in rabbinic literature and in Roman critics of Christianity, the suggestion that that Mary is someone who was a sex worker, who had sex with a Roman soldier, and this is where Jesus comes from.
But you think they...
So to be fair, I'm not unaware of what she's talking about, but that's not a... I just got done reading a junk ton of Tertullian. Okay, so Lucian and a few other people mock Christianity harshly. There's the idea, and I think Tertullian mentions it. I'm not sure right now, because like I said, I'm not feeling great. But I believe Tertullian does mention the rumor of a centurion, if you guys know Pantera, that's the name of that guy. Oh, well, I said it first, BS. BS, I said it before you typed it. Don't you take credit for that. So I'm not unaware of this mockery, but I don't think that Mark writing before... Because Mark's writing before the art mocking Jesus is common in Rome. And he's writing before the Roman theories on Christianity had developed, because Christianity was still a Jewish sect. And in the minds of Romans, during the time of the writing of the gospel, that is still a Roman... that hasn't developed yet, because Romans hadn't identified Christians as their own sect yet. They would still be thinking them as Jews. It isn't until later that the mockery begins, because they start individualizing Christians as worshiping 3 gods, as eating the flesh of their god and eating the flesh of babies, and being incestuous and being... what's the word? I guess perverted would be the right way, or not hedonistic, but they had a perversity about them because they allowed men and women to pray together, which is something that in the Roman culture, men and women don't mix. And in the Greek culture, men and women don't mix. And in the Jewish culture, men and women don't mix. But in the Christian culture, men and women can work together and work side by side together and speak together openly. That was seen as completely scandalous in the ancient times. So I don't know. I don't know how tight her theory is when it comes to that.
And
They're suggesting that she's doing it for pay, that this is the way she's making money.
I mean, it is also equally possible that they mean to imply that she was enslaved, but I think
No,
that
but I mean, couldn't she just? I assume people in the ancient world were born out of wedlock.
they were, but the accusation of being born out of wedlock invokes a kind of complex, sort of like a set of behaviors that are about sort of prostitution. In addition to, they're not really like, oh, she's kind of, she has sex with people outside of marriage. There's sort of a name for women who do that I'm trying not to use.
Yeah. Okay. Well, you well trained. Okay, so I mean,
I have a little trouble with that. Because you got Alcmene, who's the mother of Hercules, and she's seen as a great person. She's not seen as a whore for not having a husband for Hercules. And Iphicles, the human mortal son, because they're twins, is the son of a man, of a human. I don't know. I don't see her accusation in the history that I read. Because it's more about property rights, and I don't see because a god being the father of a child would be a great honor in this time period in pagan cultures. In the Judaic culture, yeah, it'd be a great scandal, but in the pagan cultures, I mean, Olympia is just trying to get everyone to believe that a python is the father. I think it's Apollos is the father of Alexander. Possibly even Zeus is the father of Alexander. So I don't know. I don't know if I buy into her reasoning, at least not on this one point.
You and I can talk about forever about this stuff because it's really interesting. There's a lot of depth to what you're covering in this book because we're scratching the surface of this book because you've got a lot going on in here that isn't just about the Gospels or Mark and Tertius. It's about a wide range of stuff going into early Christianity, and so it's a lot of stuff here. I want to. We don't have that much time left though in our talk, and I want to talk about something more broad about the book, your book itself, and about how you imagine writing a book like this. And my interest was sparked because of the way you begin the book with, is it your author's note or is it the introduction? No, it's your author's note. Mm-hmm. Where, you're dealing with, one of the reasons people haven't written this book before is because the evidence is so tantalizingly sparse that it's, you have to dig really deep to get much out of it, as you note in this. It's just, you've got to dig deep. And as you were saying before, using names and stuff, that's a really useful approach that many people haven't even thought about doing, I think. But when you're writing a book for
so again, not a scholar, I'm not pretending to be, but my understanding when I looked into this, I'm going to say maybe 13 years ago, I had just gotten done reading a bunch of Greek writing, and also looking up Hebrew writing because I was really into the Hebrew part of the Bible at that time, and in both of those you'd see a lot of names that Christian pastors, Protestant pastors, I should say, would make a big deal about. But then you go and you look up the name, and the name is he who lifts a rock or he who's shoveling. And it's not actually a name, it's a descriptor. It's a descriptor of what the person is doing because it's a background or tertiary character for the story. So, like in Odysseus, when he's on the island and different people are have certain names that we in our Western imagination make to mean something amazing, But the person who brings him an ore, the person who brings him clothes, is called the clothes runner or the ore bringer. So it's not actually a clever name. This doctor's assumption here is that those descriptive names are actually slave names. Which, again, she's saying she has German. I don't read German, but she has German reference material that says that these are compilations of slave names. These are duties that slaves doing, and the slave name matches their duty or whatever. But when I looked into this, again, 15 years ago, most of the commentary that I read, especially around stuff like Odysseus, stuff like the Iliad and the Odyssey and Hesiod and other ancient writings, is that they're simply descriptors. They're not even proper names. So that would be the second question is, are these considered proper names in the New Testament? And if they are considered proper names and not just descriptive names or tertiary background names, that would be an interesting distinction, something to look into.
General audience, you and I both know, because we both done this. It's different from writing a book for scholars, right? This is not how you would write a book for a scholarly community, because when we write our scholarly books, everything gets footnoted. You document everything, you analyze everything, you give an argument for everything. You give 20 authors who've talked about it before, kind of everything. That ain't what you're going to do in a trade book. So you have to do it differently. But with this kind of book, how do you go about doing it? Is the question that you obviously had to wrestle with. Many people who write general. I'm going to take a second to introduce the question. So, I mean, many people who write a trade book basically want to state the facts. And there's like, a lot of those books are just dry as dirt and they're not really very interesting. You have another extreme with people who just kind of like go wild with their imagination. I mean, you've probably had this experience too, where I picked up some books that were books about the historical Jesus that I at first thought were novels. I'm not going to name names here, but I mean, I thought, what, where? And so, I would consider those kind of the two extremes. So what I'd like to know is how you deal with that and have you talk about it. Because what you say at the outset is that, you've got to read between the gaps because there's so many gaps in our information. You've got to somehow come up with an imaginative way. And you quote an author that talks about critical fabulation, where the history telling is imaginative, but not untrue. That's
I'll pull Ruslan here and go. Okay, so let's look at Herodotus for a second. Okay, so you got Herodotus versus, I can't think of the name right now, the guy who wrote the Peloponnesian War. The history of the Peloponnesian War is one of the most boring books I've ever read. There's like 3 truly boring books I've ever read. One of them is it's the first ever Gothic novel. It's a giant. The second most boring book I've ever read is the Aeneid, and the first most boring book I've ever read is the Peloponnesian War. But then you read something like Herodotus, which is beautiful. I can reread Herodotus over and over and over again. He never gets boring. But he did, according to him at least, did do research. He did go to the different shrines. He did look up stuff. But was he fictionalizing or fantabulizing, as Bart Ehrman just said? I don't know. I don't think so. I think he was doing something more. I'd say he was editorializing. I would say that Livy and Hesiod and Herodotus share something with modern journalism, where they're not exactly telling the absolute truth. And they are given a perspective, but they're trying to leave the perspective open to interpretation. but they're basing it on their reporting. So they're reporting. They're reporting more than they're telling a history. Well, I think the Peloponnesian War and trying to think of another work. I would say the Civil War would be more telling histories. And I think that's different than, it's like the autumn and spring, to give it a more, it's the autumn and spring annuals versus the Romance of the Three Kingdoms. They're both telling the exact same story, the same history, but they're telling it very different. One's a novel and one's the actual dry history. And I think that's what Lucian is doing, and I think that's what a few other satirists and such are doing with their history. I wouldn't call the Aeneid a history, put it that way. So I think there's a difference between reporting, historizing, I'm going to use that word, and pentabolizing, or making an epic of the history. I think the Bible does do all three. I don't think all the Bible's reports are dry history. I don't think they're all satirizations, and I don't think they're all fictionalizations of real history. I think there's a mixture in there. But to do that with a modern scholarly work, just because it's a trade, because it's for the public audience, I think that's misleading. I think that's a bad thing to do, because there's a lot of idiots in the world. I think that's a bad call. It's misleading to the least capable that might be drawn into your audience, the least discerning.
It's a really interesting line, and that it involves imagination, but that, it just, all history in some sense is imagination.
Mm-hmm.
And so I guess I'm just wondering how do you go about deciding, like, what, where to exercise your imagination, where to, and how to market? How do you go about doing it?
Yeah, it was actually really hard and took a lot of work. And like you, I've opened up history books for the general public, and you start reading and, oh, this is interesting. But then you think in your mind, how do you know this? Where are you getting this from? That seems to be how we think now. Do we know they thought that way 2,000 years ago? And so what I did was I couldn't have all the footnotes I wanted in the book, can't have a footnote at all. So I created a website where I would explain all of the justifications for what I thought. And the great thing about the website is then I can put links in. You want to see, does he get inscription? You can just click on the link. Yeah. And oddly, I found myself doing sort of better history because I did that than I had done in my academic books. There were so many things in my academic books where because I hadn't had to do that, I maybe said things that we all assumed as historians, but that weren't true. And to write this book, so I read very widely in other periods of history where people have thought about slavery and the dearth of evidence. That's where the critical fabulation comes from. I read a lot of histories of labor, because it is, throughout the entire history of labor and clerical work, it turns out that copyists and secretaries always make changes. Always. There are no instances when they don't, sort of deliberate changes too. For a variety of reasons we hadn't thought about, I obviously went back to the material with which we're familiar, the manuscripts, the archaeological data. I looked at a lot of inscriptions. And I realized that I could document it on the website, but I also realized that what I thought of as just the facts history was also very imaginative. So for a very long time, I learned this in school. People thought, because of a scholar called Rudolf Bultmann, that the Gospel of John was put together from sources. And Bultmann said that John was writing and he had these sources on his desk, and a gust of wind blew the sources apart, and this is why they're out of order. Yeah. He didn't even bother to cross the street to the Papyrological Institute to find out if there was any evidence of this ever happening in what we had. He didn't. That's imagination. There are people who say that the reason why there's a sort of problem with the ending of the Gospel of Mark in manuscripts is because Mark got arrested and then came back later and finished it. This too is imagination. That's not more serious scholarship than what I'm doing in my book. And I actually think that this process, which was hard and required that I read many more things than I normally do, actually ended up with better history. I hope it's still engaging. But in order to be responsible, I had to check things out in ways I never had before.
Yeah. Okay. Thanks. No, that's very helpful.
I do think that's insightful to how histories are written. I find the art of history to be more interesting than the reading of history, if that makes any sense. So I have more than a few books that are both scholarly, academic, and public, common audience, lay audience friendly, that talk about how history is developed and how history is written. So yeah, I don't think she's wrong, but I do think that does hurt the credibility of history, of the historical record. Hot dog it. Okay, let's not become conspiracy theorists. Let's keep going.
One last question that's kind of related to it. That is, you're dealing with a really, really difficult topic, not just in terms of the historiography, that kind of understand the history, but because of the moral issues involved with slavery. And this is always, particularly with slavery, it's always been it's been a difficult issue for New Testament scholars, even to the level of knowing how to translate the New Testament. As you know well, the term that we used earlier, doulos, means slave. It means somebody who's owned by another person. It doesn't mean servant, somebody who's like paid to do their labor and go home at night and watch TV if they want to. It's slave, but translators are reluctant to translate it as slave because they're afraid that it will conjure up a wrong image for modern readers, and it raises the question of how you talk about an ancient phenomenon without modern conceptions of it, but it creates problems because you in your book you object,
and this is why I disagree with Dan McKellen on his no definitions have solid meaning thing, is because depending on the era that you're in, certain words are going to come up with certain contexts and certain images. I watch a guy who's anti-KJV onlyist, and I love his stuff, and he's always talking about false friends and words that have evolved out of their original meaning, but what they're describing, he'll use the original description and find a new word that matches that. And I think that's the correct approach. I don't think Dan McKellen's just throw it all out the window approach is correct. But there's something sad in that. Mind you, I feel a little sick, and I did watch that X-Men episode today, so I might be in a sad mindset. So anyway, let's keep going.
using the words slaves and masters. You prefer enslaved and enslaver. And so could you so my question is, like, how do you, when you're writing a topic like this that is just fraught in terms of kind of moral issues about a different period and a different place, how do you draw a line between maybe like a description from like somebody on the inside back then to an evaluation from people now? I mean, how do you, is there a line to be drawn?
I mean, I think the answer is carefully. You have to think about it. This isn't, it was a different topic than anything I'd written about before because of exactly the reasons you're identifying. I use enslaved and enslaver because the language of just slave sort of makes it seem as if someone is sort of, by definition, in their personhood. I want to say ontological. It's not a great word for this audience. That they are just, that's who they are. And there have been objections to that raised by historians of Atlantic slavery. But when I'm quoting someone, I'm going to use the language they used because it is brutal and I don't necessarily want to soften it. And I did worry when I was writing it, there were sections that I thought, do I want to describe this violence? This is horrible, these are horrible stories that Christians told about the mistreatment of enslaved workers. And I came to the conclusion that I think Christianity's kind of erasure of those experiences don't help anyone. I don't think anyone's well served by pretending that this language isn't there. And I don't think anyone's well served by pretending that Christianity is sort of different or good for enslaved people, because historically that has not been the case. This isn't about making people.
So my question here is, what era is she talking about? Is she talking about slavery in the early church period, slavery once the treatment of slaves, I should say, under Christians during the medieval period, before the Reformation, the way that slaves were treated under the Reformation period, under Protestant Christianity. And also by what measure, the way that we treated people just 30 years ago, and I'm talking about people of good status, just 30 years ago is now considered disrespectful and terrible today. So I'd be interested in all of that, in what she's talking about. B.S. Lewis says all of it up to a few hundred years ago. No, B.S. Lewis, I disagree with you. The greatest number of slaves the world has ever had is current. There are more slaves currently in the world than there have ever been in history. So I don't agree with that observation. But I'm curious about what she's trying to identify as brutality. Is this the correction and training of slaves under what? Because you think about how monks were trained. Monks were trained in immensely brutal ways, especially after the reforms. And I've been tempted and not tempted. I keep on putting it on my list of the Benedict. That's not a myth. I keep on meaning to put the Benedict rules, the rules of Benedict, on my reading list, and I just never get around to it. But no, slavery right now is immense and terrible. Catholic Church actually just sent out a document about that just a few days ago, and I read it here on this channel. So slavery is still around, and abuse is still around. So I'd be very interested to, especially considering that she's saying that she's willing to fantabulise history just a little bit to make a better point. I'm interested what the dry point would be. Yes, Ad Astra, I do believe that slaves should submit to their masters, if you know what that means. But yes, we do fall under authority. If you actually read Tertullian, man, he's been brought up a lot today. Tertullian talks about what it means to be a bold Christian. A lot of Christians like to use the term bold Christian. Melanie Mack, Matt Fradd, a lot of people like to use that. But if you actually look at what the term actually means in its original contents, again, I realize I'm arguing against a lot of people who believe in subjectivity here, is that you should submit and love them even as they're torturing you, but never deny God, even if that means dying for it. I would recommend go watch my review of Tertullian's Apology. It is a very it's a good review, and it explains exactly what this is, what radical submission is, and radical Christian subversion and Christian resistance, and how it's supposed to be done, and exactly how it's supposed to be done. It's a really good manual for Christian resistance to greater powers. I wish more Christians would read Tertullian. They don't, because he, in his later life, later people accuse him in his later life that he may or may not have supported the North Carthaginian Montanist. And some people even accuse him of leading the North Carthaginian Montanist. But that is disputed by scholars such as these people. Do I think owning people as property is objectively immoral? I'm owned by the U.S. government, and I'm owned by my boss. I can get fired at any moment, and I can lose my career and lose my home. And you can't live without paying taxes. You are not truly free. You are not truly free, B.S. Lewis. Even the freedom promised by Christianity is just the freedom to worship God without shame and without having to hide it. True freedom is illusionary and ephemeral and hard to grasp and even harder to maintain. Look at P. Diddy. P. Diddy thought he was free and now he's going to jail. No, you can't quit. You need to have food. You need to have a job. You need to have a home, or else you're going to be homeless. Yeah, there's consequences. And a homeless person can be abused more easily than a person who has a home. And they can be objectified more easily and fall into actual slavery, human trafficking, drug abuse. Drug abuse is an amazing type of slavery. It's addiction is a slavery, I think, even greater than sin is a slavery. I think drug addiction is a greater slave. It's monstrous. No, I think your definition of slavery and my definition of slavery might be a little bit different, B.S. Lewis. But no, I think addiction is a type of slavery. I think sin is a type of slavery. And I think the working poor are people who are people who work, but the bare minimum for them to survive is not reached by their pay. They are getting slave wages. And people who are getting slave wages are subject to the abuses of the government and to abuses of people in power and to abuses of their managers and people who are more powerful than them. And I think that is a type of exploitation of the poor and of the helpless. And that is in line with Christian thinking and in line with Catholicism, by the way.
They'll feel bad, but it is about being sensitive to the ways that these texts are received today by people who, for whom slavery is more pressing. You know, that this language that Esau Macaulay has used of slavery sitting in the soul of Black and brown people. And I think anyone who writes on this subject has to be aware of that, has to be aware that there are people for whom this is powerful and violent even today. And so I think it's a very difficult line to walk. And I hope that the parts of this book, which I think of as history, not theology, that are helpful for people sort of invested in projects of liberation, that they will take up the parts that are useful and they will discard what is not.
Right.
And I'm going to end the video in a few minutes, and I'm going to end it on what she just said right there, because I think maybe me and BS would have a very hard, like, me and him rarely disagree on real things ever. I think here me and him will really disagree, because I have friends who I went to school with who are migrant workers. I have friends who have 5 people living in a single room house that they rent. I have a family member right now who, because of the working poor situation, is about to be cut off of her cancer medication, and she will die. She was given one month of cancer medication for her kidneys. So I think me and you have a very fundamental difference of opinion here, but I've seen people who are, no, that is slavery. It is absolutely slavery. You're working for less than what you can eat, than what you can do. That is what slavery was. Slavery is not as if slaves didn't get paid. It's not as if slaves didn't get paid. Slaves got paid. They got paid in portions. They got paid in money. They got paid in different ways. Slavery is not limited to the imagination of what we think slavery was in the South, because there's an actual history of slavery in the South. There's an actual history of how slaves were treated and how they were paid and how they were respected and how they were given dignity. And it is gross and grotesque, and it is absolutely a crime against humanity. And it still goes on today. And slavery is not what's in the movies. Even the best slave movie doesn't come close to what actual slavery is. And again, one of the conversations me and you, BS, had a long time ago, arguing about whether or not, if there were slaves in Egypt, what were they talking about? It goes back to a very interesting argument from one of the top archaeologists in Egypt. I think he's been killed or he died recently. But he was talking about how if you take the story literally, you have a problem of the Jewish people wanting coin for their pay and the Egyptians giving bread and wine, or bread and beer as pay. And they thought of it as a lot of pay. And so it was a difference between the two cultures understanding what pay is. And I always love that explanation. So when you can dehumanize a person or think of a person as a means to an end, you can justify anything, and you can say that, oh, I'm paying them, or oh, I'm doing this, or I'm doing that. But that's still slavery. And if you go back to ancient times, slavery isn't always and forever. You can get manumissioned. You can become a freeman. In fact, yesterday's video, they were talking about how most of the people who own, all the people who own bookstores in the ancient world are slaves. They're ex-slaves who become free. So I just don't think you have a very good comprehension of what slavery is or what destitution is. And that's not a runaway slave either. The act of manumission is a very long tradition, and there are African slaves from the South who would be manumissioned and would be freed. And even some of them would have plantations of their own where they would own slaves. This is reality. This is not a fantasy world where slaves were treated a certain way because of whatever reason. The people who owned slaves thought they were justified, and they were wrong, and they would abuse people. And the people who own slaves today, whether it's a sex slave, whether it's someone who they trap into their house, whether it's someone who they treat as a maid, but the person isn't free and can't leave, and they're abused, that's all real. Nope, that's slavery. Slavery is not... So ancient slaves could be rented out, even modern slaves could be rented out. They can be used by other people. I just think you need to look up on how slavery actually worked. I don't think you have a good understanding of slavery. I don't know if you're from the South. I'm from the South. We had to learn about slavery in school, and we have plantations. There's actually several plantations near where I live. It's an ugly thing, and it's really abusive. And there's different types of slavery. There's not just one type of slavery. So again, I just feel like maybe you're not read up on this, or you just have a difference of opinion here. But regardless, slavery is not a good thing. I know. I read his book and reviewed it on this channel. Like I said, BS, I just think you're either being emotionally triggered right now, or you and I just have a different understanding of that. So Ad Astra says there's a category of slave that gets passed down as inheritance. Not all could be freed. Yes and no, because generationally, you don't have like, I'm going to say 100 generations, just to use a high number, of a single family of slaves. They would be killed. They would be conquered. The people who were slavers would then become slaves themselves to other people who would conquer them. I'd be more interested in not doing it here in the chat with people who have the same information that I have. I'd be interested in talking to some of these academics about, or maybe even getting a book with good references on what the slave numbers were in Israel, in Jerusalem. What was the slave population among Israelites in the time of Jesus? That would be an interesting thing. Now, I'm not talking about slaves to the Roman culture, slaves to people in the Jewish culture. I'd be very interested to see that, because there's definitely slaves of Jewish people. So I'd be interested to see what those numbers are. That would be an interesting thing. And to see, how they lived, how they worked, all that kind of stuff. That's something that I have not seen studies of. I've seen studies of Roman slavery. I've seen studies of Greek slavery. I've seen studies of all of that. B.S. Lewis, like I said, me and you have a very different understanding. And if you want to come on and debate, you're welcome to come on and debate, but I'm not going to debate you in my chat. If you want to debate, you can come on the channel and we can have this conversation, because you're purposely misunderstanding what I'm saying. And I've seen you do that before with me. I like you a lot. So if you want to have this argument, have it on my channel where we can actually talk facts. Please. But, yeah. I'm about to end the chat, so if anybody has any last questions, ask them now. I mean, it could just be a dialogue, but yeah, I'm totally down to debating you on this. B.S. Lewis, I don't deny that the Bible has slavery. I don't deny that the Bible endorses types of slavery. I don't deny the history of slavery. I don't believe that there's any I don't believe there's any objective morality against slavery in any kind of the classic theology. So, so I don't even know what would we debate, unless you're going to debate whether or not what type of slavery counts as slavery. All right, we're going to go to the 20-minute mark. But again, if anyone has any questions, Astra, if you have any questions on that, on what me and BS are arguing about, I'm down to answer that while there's still time. BS, if you're going to be around, I'm not feeling great, but if you're going to be around, I can actually switch over to StreamYard, and we can have the conversation right now. Just understand I don't feel 100%. Let me know if you want to do that, because I really am going to close off this stream. The Bible doesn't say that conditions like that are evil. It just says it's a condition. And I've told you before, I don't get all my morality just straight from the Bible. That's not what that's not what Catholics do, or what Orthodox do. We have at least 3 traditions to draw from. All right. Well, B.S. Lewis is busy cartooning, so I guess we're not going to do that right now. If you want to, I'm going to do an open stream, I guess tomorrow, I'm not going to have that argument right now. Yes, I'm going to have an open stream tomorrow. Hopefully I'll be feeling better. Pixie's supposed to come into the room tomorrow as well. So it'd be like a reunion from Gar Streams days. And hopefully I'll be feeling better. So I'll be up to having a good argument or a good conversation. Right now, my stomach's just really killing me, buddy. Anyway, once again, I love you all. Have a great night. Sorry about it being a short one tonight, although now I'm 20 minutes past what I said I was going to do. My stomach has been killing me since about 1 o'clock this afternoon, so I'm not feeling good. Peace, like, subscribe. You know what? I will do my bonus stuff. I know everybody hops out when I do my bonus material. I will do my bonus material tonight. Thank you, Ad Astra. Yes, B.S. Lewis, I know I need a weekend room. Just to be really blunt, right now I got an audience of 4, so I'm assuming everybody in here right now is my friend, even though we don't know each other. I quit my part-time job that I fought really hard for today. I'm starting a real job. I'm back to working a real job either Saturday or Monday with real pay and real hours. And I negotiated with the recruiter and with the boss to get time off to take care of my dad and to go back to school. So my plan is to go back for a master's in... I wanted to do the Bible is literature because that's kind of what I've been doing for the last 7 years here at my house by myself. But depending on the school that says yes to me and what's available, it's going to be UT, the University of Texas. Depending on what's available, I might have to take like a Bible critical thing. And part of the reason why I'm doing it is because after my dad's very sick with Alzheimer's, after we have to put him in a home, my wife wants me to move to China. So I will be teaching at a university in China, probably in the next 5 years. I don't know if that's actually going to happen. Me and my wife can still negotiate. I think I still have some sway over her, but we'll see. But yeah, so I do plan on getting a critical degree in Bible scholarship, I was thinking about getting a degree in apologetics, and the BS of apologetics is too much for me. I'd much rather talk about the truth and about the facts. So that's what I'm going to pursue. Wish me luck. Anyway, like I said, I'm just talking to my friends right now. There's an audience of 5, but I'm just talking to the people who've been on my channel for over 7 years and have been supporting me. So that's my plan, is to go back to school, and this new job will give me a chance to do it, and it'll let me take care of my dad. And that's one of the reasons I had to quit my previous job, is that I was working sometimes 6:30 in the morning till 11 o'clock at night. And with my dad's dementia, it just made it impossible for me to care for him properly. So now I don't have to hire a bunch of nurses or a bunch of maids to come into the house and spend half my income. I can come home every lunch and take care of my dad, and maybe 2 or 3 days a week have someone stay here with him. So I don't want to get emotional. I already feel sick. I don't want to, I don't know if you can tell, I'm paler than usual. I don't want to also cry. So, and I already had an emotional breakdown from that X-Men episode. Anyway, peace, like, and subscribe. I love you all. BS, please come in tomorrow if I have an open room. I'll gladly talk to you there. Ad Astra, I don't know if we've ever spoken in person, but if I do an open room, feel free to hop in. Everybody else that's listening, have a great night. Ad Astra, you're not kidding. It's tough. All right. I love you all. Bye. Good night. God bless. My dad's, someone asked in the question, my dad is 86 years old. But yeah.